Hi, I'm Mr. Walberg, and I'm glad you're here. And welcome to my basement. In our last class, we fought and won the Revolutionary War to go establish America as an independent country. Today, we're going to talk about the first draft of that country, and that's America under the Articles of Confederation. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Walberg's A-Push. History class rides again. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to, number 5, identify the achievements and the problems of that Confederation government. You should be able to describe the expansion of religious liberty after the Revolution. And number 7, describe the social conditions in Articles era America. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 5. Congress approved the new government in November of 1777, a document known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were the first written constitution of the United States. It structured a general government that only had one branch of government. It was only a legislature, and the legislature was only one house. It was a unicameral, legislative-only type of government. There was no president, there was no Supreme Court, there's no upper or lower house, no judiciary. A confederation is a style of government where several independent members all agree to join in together. It's a legitimate style of government. Doesn't have a good, that term confederation doesn't have a good rep to us moderns, but political scientists would recognize it as a real form of government. Where members agree to play together but still maintain their independence. So you'll notice the Articles of Confederation really emphasize state autonomy. The only powers granted to the national government as like a whole of the body were things like declaring war or conducting foreign affairs and for making treaties. It's like the whole of the Articles of Confederation were about how the United States should approach the outside world. Also, amending the Articles took a unanimous state approval, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But Congress established these, okay, so a confederation, if you've ever played on a team where it feels like everybody's on the same team, but everybody's really kind of playing for themselves, that's the model of a confederation government. And I think you even see that in the name the United States of America. The term state, the rest of the world uses that term state to mean country. We're kind of rare that we use it to mean what other countries would think of as a province. But if you think about our early days of a country and the model of how we could theoretically be set up, you imagine that we are independent countries, that Virginia is its own country, and Massachusetts is its own country, and Pennsylvania and New York. And they all just agree to work together in so as it relates to the rest of the world. So that's kind of the model of the Articles of Confederation. Congress established national control over any land to the west of the 13 states and devised rules for its settlement. So the parts that weren't properly speaking part of the states was federal land and under federal control. Subpoint B. The peace after the Revolution brought the rapid settlement into the frontier. Taking possession of the land seems to be like just the proper American thing to do. The Revolution inspired yeomen and upstart entrepreneurs to go demand property rights and access to Western land in those new state governments. As Congress faced conflicting pressures from settlers and from land speculators regarding Western development, there was a lot of control over how fast can land become available to purchase and at what price and who gets the right to purchase it. In the immediate aftermath of independence, Congress took the position that because say groups of Indians had aided the British, Indians had forfeited any right to the access to their lands. Leaders feared that some unregulated flow across the Appalachian Mountains could provoke constant warfare with Indians that challenged any movement into, say, the Ohio River Valley. And in 1784, the United States used military force, or the threat of military force, to go push the pro-British Iroquois people to go sign what's known as the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix relinquished a lot of Iroquois land in New York and Pennsylvania. And then further to the west, the United States induced Indian peoples to give up most of what we would soon have the future state of Ohio. These are treaties, so they appear to be negotiated because treaties are negotiated, but most of the negotiation I think we should just call bullying. Subpoint C. Like the British, American officials found it very difficult to regulate the thirst for new land. The British were always having problems with colonialists going and, colonists going and crossing the Appalachian Mountains and going and setting into Indian country. And once we move from British colony to independent country, that doesn't really go away. So now the Americans are having a hard time, trying to keep Americans from going into that area. So Congress established 3 ordinances, and we just kind of think of these together as the land ordinances that provide for the orderly settlement of what they called the Old Northwest. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 of them. Keeping track of the specific dates isn't going to be important for our APUSH exam in May, but I do want to let you know how it's going to lay out. The 1784 Land Ordinance started a pattern of territories becoming states. So that's the first thing. How does a territory become a state? Congress created the Southwest Territory and the Mississippi Territories, also the states, the future states of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. That was all on land which had previously been part of North Carolina and Georgia. And in those areas, slavery was allowed. Now, slavery is going to be the subtext of more or less everything that we talk about in this class through the end of the semester, through period 5. It's sometimes it's the outright plot and sometimes it's the subplot, but slavery will always be in the shadows and the penumbras of everything we talk about from here on out. It's the unsettled issue in American history. Little b here. The 1785 Land Ordinance started the rectangular grid survey system for townships. That came at a price of $1 an acre, and mostly private companies and mostly speculators benefited from the land sale. So a speculator is sort of a gambler. They go and buy land with the expectation that they can go sell it later for a higher price. It's not just land, but that's kind of the idea of speculation. They're not buying the land for themselves. They're buying it for resale. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance outlined the step-by-step process that territories had to follow to become states. It also allowed slavery it outlawed slavery north of the Ohio River. Now, in theory, Indian land wouldn't be taken without their consent, but as we know, in theory and practice are the same thing. In practice, they're not. These ordinances provided for orderly settlement in the West while reducing the prospect of colonies showing up of states, so that Pennsylvania would have an area that's sort of the Pennsylvania colony. All that was avoided by nationalizing the land sales there. But they also contribute to future issues over slavery and conflict with Native Americans. Subpoint D. I'm going to get theoretical for a second. Writers at the time were frequently juxtaposing the ideas of freedom and slavery as the 2 extremes of happiness and misery in society, and that the free are happy and the slaves are miserable. But during the debates over British rule, the term slavery was often invoked as a political category, not as an actual, human bondage of being slaves, but as a political science category for people who are denied one's personal and political rights by an arbitrary government. So people who lacked the right to vote in British affairs, they considered themselves to be enslaved. By the Revolution, people contrasted Britain as a kingdom of slaves with America, a country of free men. And when we understand here, I want you to think of slavery I hate to use the word ironic, but it smacks of irony that America becomes a slave-holding country, whereas Great Britain was literally freeing slaves during the war. But America thinks of themselves categorically as slaves because they don't have the power they believe that the British Crown is denying them, while Americans are also denying their own slaves the power and freedom and autonomy there. It's a real irony that America's crying for liberty while enslaving African Americans, or Africans. They don't really even have the category of Americans yet. And that irony wasn't lost on some people. Take, for instance, the British statesman Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was a member of Parliament. As you know, I was a political science major. That's what I got my degree in. And I loved studying people like Edmund Burke, sort of a proto-political scientist who would go through and lay out these understandings of liberty and independence and the role of government. And he's, infused with the Enlightenment and a sense of morality that nobody else does. He's a brilliant theorist in ways that just really didn't exist. It's a shame that more people don't spend time in Edmund Burke's work. And also the British writer Samuel Johnson. They both, were pretty keen to this irony. But it wasn't just the British looking in. American Benjamin Rush warned in 1773, so even before the Revolution starts, that slavery was a national crime, and believing that it would bring its own national punishment. Most of the founders owned slaves at one point or another in their respective lives. Even people that, would later regret it. A lot of people got their hands in the slave trade. John Adams, Thomas Paine, they were notable exceptions that they never really dabbled in slavery at all. But other people, like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, as a younger man, owned a slave, but later emancipated him and spent the later part of his adult life arguing against slavery and became one of the loudest voices for abolition, but not before he sullied his hands in the practice. Some patriots argued even that black slavery was what it made possible for white people to have freedom, like enabling the economic conditions to get there. And I don't know, that's a pretty hard argument on my ears, but it was an argument they were making. Subpoint E. Nearly 100,000 of the slaves deserted their owners during the Revolutionary War and fled to British lines. It was actually part of a condition if a slave wanted to go and fight for their emancipation, they could flee their owners and go and join the British side, and if the British won, they would get their freedom. At the end of the war, 15,000 black people accompanied the British out of the country. As the British were leaving, 15,000 black people went with them. They established, many ended up in Nova Scotia, up in Canada, but also back in England, and also in an area known as Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a West African settlement. It was established by Great Britain for former American slaves. It was part of a kind of a persistent idea of a back to Africa movement. That, obviously we can't have black people in America, so if you're going to be free and not slaves, then you should just leave America and go back to Africa. That term "back to Africa" will get used in a couple of different ways, but that's the way I'm going to use it here. It's not very sensitive to the history of people or to the geography of Africa, but it was the first model, I think, of re-Africanization. And some escaped slavery in America only to be captured and re-enslaved in the West Indies, and never really escaping that cycle of awful. For a brief moment, the revolutionary upheaval appeared to even threaten the continued existence of slavery for some slaveholders, primarily in the Upper South. Places like Virginia and Maryland began to provide emancipation for their slaves. You never find this in the Deep South. In the Lower South, the emancipation process never really started. But I think you see it in the Upper South, in Maryland and Virginia. There's kind of an interesting case in Maryland and Virginia. They're different than the rest of the slaveholding nation. It appears like for Virginia and Maryland, their economies are different. That it's not cotton country down there. It's tobacco country. It's a different slave culture. It's not rice kingdom. It's tobacco country. And there's a feeling, I think, in Virginia and Maryland that slavery is not sustainable in the long run. It's probably a business to get out of, but I really do think a lot of Virginians just couldn't figure out how. Thomas Jefferson is a classic case of this, and I hope we get a chance to talk about that more later. Subpoint F. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were some important weaknesses that just had a hard time being addressed. It was that every state retained its independence, so every state is operating like its own country. But the Revolution had created an economic crisis that crossed state borders, and no state could individually address very well. A major weakness, so the Confederation had the authority to declare war and peace. It also had the authority to make treaties and to adjudicate any disputes between the states. They could print money and they could requisition funds from the states, but the money wouldn't be backed up by anything. And anytime they ask for money from the states, a requisition is just like an ask. It's sort of a demand, but it's a demand that somebody else has to go fulfill. So, but they couldn't impose their own taxes. And I think this is what most people think of as the great tripping block for the Articles of Confederation. The Articles also required a unanimous agreement from any of the states to pass amendments. There were several proposals to do so, but none of them ever passed. Unanimity is pretty hard to achieve, especially with 13 states all protecting their own interests. I kind of think about it. If you have, 4 friends and you're all going to go out to dinner, 4 of the 5 of you then might all say you want to go to Chipotle, but we all know who that one friend is. It's like, I want to go to Arby's. And Arby's is a terrible decision, and nobody ever likes Arby's. It's the worst of all the possible fast food options, but there's always somebody that wants to do it or make some bad decision. And I think that's kind of like amending the articles. Even if something is a really good idea, it's hard to get unanimity on anything. Subpoint G. Here I want to introduce one of the, I think, most interesting and undersung people of the revolutionary generation, a guy named Robert Morris. Robert Morris Jr. He was one of the richest people in the entire country, and in 1781, he was a wealthy merchant that helped finance the revolution. In 1781, he devised a plan for a new American national bank. This bank needed money to go operate with, and they were going to operate with money on as a loan from France. He and Alexander Hamilton, who will become really important to our story soon, he hoped that the bank would stabilize the currency that was the continental currency. So the Articles of Confederation could print money, but they was of questionable value and of unlimited printing. And Morris thought, if we have a national bank, we can stabilize this inflation problem. So Congress approved it. He convinced the Congress to go approve the Bank of North America, and it stabilized the American economy. It was pretty successful. It also financed the war effort and established credit of the United States with nations of Europe. Robert Morris was immediately appointed to the United States Superintendent of Finance, a job that would be roughly equivalent to the Secretary of the Treasury, and then he would go direct that new bank. In January of 1782, so the next year, Morris drafted a proposal that he presented to Congress to recommend the establishment of a national mint. So not just printing money for currency, but actually mint to go coin American money as a whole. So rather than all the states would have been coining their own money, or but no, to go create a national mint to go do so. He also encouraged the idea of decimal coinage. Decimal coinage is what we use today. You can think of writing your money as $23.15, and everything after the point is the decimal coinage. That wasn't actually all that standard before the turn of the 1800s. In the 1700s and before, people were more likely to use fractional currency, where you could figure out what's a $0.50 and a $0.25. Those numbers aren't crazy to us, but an $0.08 of a dollar and a $0.16 of a dollar, and you start dividing up things. And my grandpa would talk about coins, and he'd say, "Oh yes, get 2 pence or 4 pence or even hay pennies as a half penny." I'm not old enough to remember that, but there was a time that was in there. It's all this fractional currency, and Morris wanted to replace it with decimal currency, which is what we use today, and I think people generally like it. But those ideas were seen as too radical, and they failed in Congress. Robert Morris believed that the national government would never really be financially solvent without the ability to raise taxes, with either as levy taxes on the people or as tariff taxes on raising money on imports. He said they're never going to be solvent until that would be there. So he proposed an amendment to the Articles of Confederation to allow an import duty, or basically a tariff, a tax on imports. But he was unable to get all the 13 states to agree so. The Confederation didn't have the power to tax, and the states didn't want to go put a new tariff on. And so the amendment failed. So Congress instead said, we're going to finance our country by selling that land in the Trans-Appalachian West. So we have all that land out there. We'll go sell it, and that'll bring income. And let's do that and exhaust our resources before we go putting a tax on ourselves. Robert Morris said that that's not a long-term plan, and he resigned as the superintendent of finance in 1784, kind of in a huff. And he was right. The land sales didn't really work out. They weren't successful at raising funds, and Congress was unable to provide economic answers. So without really an economic answer, states began to adapt their own economic policies and print their own currency and allow debtors to pay back creditors in installments, and it was kind of a hodgepodge system. And that's going to hang on to that topic. We're going to get to it here in just a little bit. But first I want to go to Roman numeral number 6 and talk about religious toleration. America's religious beliefs in early America, they were strongly influenced by the idea of Enlightenment-era cynicism, where people just didn't really trust religion as a thing. And a lot of people believed that religion, while it was important, it was only important for secular reasons. It had the ability to instill virtue and public morality, but it wasn't necessarily as a path to salvation. And I think we see a lot of Enlightenment undercutting of religion as itself because it's seen as a social tool, not as like a theological pursuit of God. Deism was a popular religious belief, and we've talked about deism before, but I want to spend another minute on it. Deism is the idea that there was this benevolent creator, that God exists and that God is good and that God has created everything, but that he didn't intervene in human affairs. It's kind of like, I think of it as like a watchmaker God, that God builds the watch and winds it up, but then lets it tick. He's not stopping and restarting the watch. I think of a wind-up monkey as you wind up the monkey and he bangs his cymbals, but there's nothing that you do to interfere. Like the monkey doesn't take direction from you, even as the winder of the toy. So that's kind of the idea of deism, that God has created the world and put it into motion, but leaves it to its own fate after that. Take, for instance, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is maybe America's most famous deist, although really Jefferson, his religious beliefs are kind of a mess. It appears that he'd never really sorted out his beliefs in religion. And that's actually kind of true for a lot of Jefferson. He has beliefs, but just sort of leaves them kind of scattered around. One of my favorite American historians is a guy named Joseph Ellis, and he's referred to Jefferson as the American Sphinx, like the guy that you understand all the parts, but none of it seems to work together as a whole. I think it's a pretty good way of talking about Jefferson. And when we look at his religious beliefs, and categorically we call him a deist, although it's kind of a mess on what he believes, and there's no real unifying theory of what his Jeffersonian approach to theology. But I think a great example of his pursuit is that he created what's known as the Jefferson Bible, where he cut and paste pieces, like literally with a knife and glue, cutting and pasting was something before it was a computer term. But he was literally cutting and pasting pieces of the Bible together, excising parts of the scripture where Jesus, like New Testament, where Jesus is doing anything divine, any of the miracles, any of the claims towards divinity, anything that seems to be supernatural. Jefferson cuts it all out of the Bible and then puts pieces back together. He leaves the story of Jesus as a morality play. That, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's okay. You got an itinerant guy wandering around telling people stuff, but there's not much to back it up on it. But it's kind of a good example of how Americans approached religion at the time. They understood religion, but skeptically so. It wasn't just Jefferson, though. Over the years, John Adams and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they all had religious skepticism of the Enlightenment era. They would also vacillate. I mean, Hamilton's a really interesting story that he's fairly religious as a young man, and as an old man, but in the middle he's kind of not interested. John Adams is he speaks with some religious fervor, but he appears to be kind of shifty in his understanding of Benjamin Franklin is a hot mess. He was a Puritan turned atheist turned deist turned believer later. I don't know, pretty typical of the time. A lot of the leaders of the revolution, they wanted to avoid the European-style conflicts over religion. And America's longstanding skeptical and anti-Catholic beliefs, they never totally subsided, but the young country was, for a while, fairly tolerant of Catholicism. You look at things like, there was a signer of the Declaration of Independence who was Catholic. I mean, there's one, Carroll of Carrollton. There's only one of them, but there is one, and that seems kind of notable in itself. But we had an alliance with France, and France is a Catholic country, and then negotiating how we're going to deal with Quebec, and Quebec as a Catholic colony, that those things softened a lot of the anti-Catholic rhetoric. Don't worry, it'll be back later. Subpoint B. Ending British rule also immediately threw into question the privileged position that was enjoyed by the established church. So, when we were British colonies, there was the Church of England, and it was established in every state or every colony, and the the bishop of whoever would get tax money to go support the church. And once we become independent, that kind of gets thrown into question again. So wait a minute, we have state-established church, and it's an Anglican church, like the Church of England. We're not really into the England thing anymore, so how are we going to do this? And so you see a disestablishment of established churches. It was a drive to separate church and state, and it brought together deists on one hand who want to get out of the religion business, but it also brought together believers who wanted to have some religious diversity and believe in things that weren't just the established church to do so. So states disestablished their churches and then deprived them of specific public funding and legal privileges. There were 7 state constitutions. So of the 13 states, 7 of them, specifically in the constitutions, began with declarations of rights. And of those 7, every one of them included a commitment to the free exercise of religion, saying that people could go practice whatever religion they want to. But there wasn't total religious toleration. I want to make that clear. Some states limited religious freedoms, things like barring Jews from holding voting and privileges or holding office. They were pretty much blocked out of every state except New York, and Massachusetts was publicly financing other religions. In every state, Catholics earned the right to vote without persecution. And here I want to go to subpoint C and talk about religious liberty in kind of a specific sense. And we turn back to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote a bill for the Virginia legislature. There was a bill for establishing religious freedom, and it was passed in 1786. That disestablished the Church of England in Virginia. It also guaranteed freedom of religion for all religions. This is Jefferson, who kind of believes everything and believes nothing, right? He said all Christian denominations have the right to practice, but also Jews and Muslims and Hindus. I don't know how many Muslims and Hindus were in the country at the time, but in Virginia, they could practice their religion. It was a precursor to the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause that would show up in the United States Constitution in our favorite First Amendment. James Madison insisted that one of the reasons why you separate church and state was to reinforce the principle that our new nation offered asylum to the persecuted and the oppressed of every nation and religion. From the get-go, the separation of church and state isn't about keeping the church out of politics, although there's a part of it there. It's also about keeping politics out of the church. The wall of separation works both ways. Roman numeral number 7. I want to talk for a little bit about slavery again and kind of go pick up this story. In between 1777 and 1804, every state north of Maryland took steps to go provide for emancipation. They all took little pieces to go get slaves freed. But abolition in the North was a slow process. Even though there is a motion towards abolition, it was a slow process, and it typically only applied to the future children of current slaves. So, like, current slaves are going to be slaves for the rest of their lives or until they're emancipated or escape. But their children might be free, and that was phasing in various states of the Union. Slaves in the North, though, more or less still had to rely on escape or getting freed by their owners to go get their freedom. There were still even some existing slaves in the North clear up until the years right before the Civil War. It's hard to think of like the North, which we think of as like the good guys on slavery. There were still slaves right up until the eve of the Civil War. Subpoint B. After the American Revolution, free black communities established their own churches and their own schools and their own leaders, all coming into existence in those years after the Revolution. Take, for instance, 1776, there were fewer than 10,000 free black people in the entire country, but by 1810, there was nearly 200,000 of them. In states of the North, free black men often even enjoyed the right to vote in these brand new state constitutions. Still, the Revolution didn't end slavery for black people and actually increased the amount of slaves by more than 200,000 in the years of 1776 to 1790, all down in the South. Subpoint C. Okay, I want to talk about for a minute, pick up the storyline about how states are handling their economies after the Revolution. A storyline I told you we'd come back to, and here we are back to it. Peace often brings recession. That's a normal pattern that will be with us through the rest of the semester and even part into our next semester. It's not unusual for the years after the war for the economy to go take a downturn for a while. You have all of the people that were off at war coming home to reclaim their jobs, and so displacing the people that held the jobs in their place, but also the wartime production of building, the bullets and growing the food, and suddenly all that wartime production isn't necessary for war anymore, and it takes a while for the economies to go readjust. So it's not unusual right after a war to have an economic downturn for a while, and we see that in the Revolutionary War also. So peace brought recession. back when we were a British colony, you had the British Navigation Act, which bars Americans from trading with the British West Indies. But once we are our own country, those acts go away, and suddenly low-priced British goods are flooding American markets, and American producers are having a hard time competing with all these cheap imports. States also were saddled with these big war debts. They just fought a really expensive war, and they had taken out bonds to go pay for it. So a war bond is where, take for instance, I would go buy a war bond, and I would give money to the government, and I would buy this piece of paper called a bond, and at the maturity of the bond, I would get my money back, plus the interest that it accrued on it. It's how governments go into debt, and it's not just war bonds, but here we're talking about war bonds. But, bonds still exist today, and it's a way of financing government debt. So states had a lot of these outstanding bonds, and if I ran on hard money, or if I, hard times and I needed cash, or if I thought that maybe the government wasn't going to pay me back, I might take my bond, take my sheet of paper, and go sell it to you and say, hey, I bought this for $100, but I'll sell it to you for $80. Then you have a $100 note. You've paid $80 for it, and if the government goes and repays it back, then you get the full 100. You've made a profit of 20, plus you get the interest back on it. That turns you into a financial speculator. Speculation has been more or less legal all the time. It's a type of gambling. It's on the future. It's to make an investment move. But it also, some people think it's shady. I'm not sure that it's carries its shady reputation as much today as it has at other times in American history. But a lot of people think that it's like, you're not making money the fair way. You're not taking the risk and actually supporting the war. You're just trying to make the money on Walberg's risk, and that's making money off money, and it's not actually producing something in the economy. And people think that speculation sometimes is wrong. I don't think we see that too much today, but you'll find it hangs around in American history for a long time. People think it's just a deceitful way to go make money. So you have all of these speculators demanding that state governments redeem all those war bonds and redeem them quickly and at full value. Now, if states need to do that, then they need to go pay off those bonds. They need to go raise money quickly, and they're going to go raise taxes to go do so. But yeoman farmers who are, already got to go, and manufacturers, they already got to compete against cheap British imports. So they're watching their profits go down. We're in a bit of a recession. And then the state goes and dumps big taxes on you as well, and you're taking it from both sides. You're paying higher taxes, but also earning less money than you used to do so. Some states gave tax relief to go bail out the manufacturers there, but you don't find it in Massachusetts. They do it a little bit differently. Massachusetts didn't pass those relief plans, and so a lot of farmers, they're ridden with debt. They're carrying the seizure of their land. They're afraid the government's going to go take the land if they don't pay the taxes on it, and so they remember what has happened in the American Revolution. They said, oh, yes, I know this story before. You've got an oppressive government raising taxes on me, and it gets harder to pay, and I'm going to go resist it. So what do Massachusetts do? They go and force the courts closed in western Massachusetts. They basically said, well, you can't seize my land if you can't get into the government and go get in and order a court order. So they were intimidating judges and closing down the courts there. They modeled their protests on the Revolutionary era. They were using liberty trees and liberty poles, and the lack of such debtor relief legislation in Massachusetts provoked an armed uprising led by a person named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays had been a captain in the Revolutionary War, and he led Shays' Rebellion, which was a struggle against taxes opposed by an unresponsive government. It resembled resistance to the British Stamp Act as well. Massachusetts said, okay, so we've got now a military insurrection fighting against us, and Massachusetts responded, and stop me if you've heard something like this before, with a riot act outlawing illegal assemblies. But the state was too indebted. The state was too poor to go raise its own state militia to go put down Shays' Rebellion and enforce this riot act. And so they need somebody else to come and bail them out. And who bails them out? The governor of the governor of Massachusetts, James Bowdoin. He's a man of some means, and he uses his own money to go raise a militia. So he's like paying his own soldiers to go put down the Shays' Rebellion move in the winter of 1786 to 1787 to go disperse Shays' army. Shays' Rebellion is kind of like the thing that people say, okay, I don't know if the Articles of Confederation are working. This doesn't seem like a good model. It convinced people for a need for stronger government to go protect property rights, believing that property rights are a way of it's a form of liberty. It's a form of private liberty. And he says that, but we also need a government to keep people from giving too much power in the hands of the people. That, if all we get is mob rule, then that's also not freedom. That's all. We don't have the freedom to go, be individuals. We're going to go escape the mob all the time. A lot of middle-class patriot families who'd suffered during the war believed that, man, we've traded one type of tyranny for another type of tyranny. And other people felt that the entire government, the experiment in a republic was failing, and maybe we needed a stronger national government in its place. And that brings us to the nationalists of the 1790s. As money questions was dominating the post-war agenda, officials like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they looked at the problems saying that, no, these are national problems. These are not state problems. They're national problems. And they called for a stronger central government to go handle these issues. The concerns voiced by critics of the articles, they found a sympathetic hearing among men who had developed a national consciousness during the Revolution. Without tariff revenues, Congress couldn't pay the interest on foreign debt, but key commercial states in the North and most of the planters in the South said, okay, well, we don't want tariffs because tariffs bring reciprocal tariffs. But we also, bondholders, they said, well, we need taxes because we need to go pay off the national government. And we want tariff protection. The artisans were like, we want tariff protection so we keep the foreign goods from flowing in. But tariffs also bring reciprocal tariffs. And if we put a tariff on British goods, the British are going to put a tariff on our goods. And merchants wanted open access to the British markets. So in order to prevent another internal conflict, things like Shays' Rebellion, nationalists in Congress said, okay, we need to go make some serious revisions to the Articles of Confederation. And they called for a convention in Philadelphia to go revise the Articles. Of course, that revision doesn't play out the way that a lot of people expected it. And that story is awesome, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.